Story 1.
It was a cold November afternoon when the Anderson family gathered at the old family estate for their traditional Thanksgiving dinner. The house, built in the 1800s, creaked and groaned with age, but it was still standing strong, holding onto its memories like the worn-out photo albums scattered around the dusty attic. The smell of roasted turkey filled the air, a comforting scent that had marked every Thanksgiving for as long as anyone could remember. But something felt off this year. As they sat around the massive oak table, everyone was talking and laughing, enjoying the familiar warmth of family. The turkey, golden brown and perfectly cooked, sat proudly in the center. But as each family member carved a piece and took their first bite, an unsettling quietness began to spread. John, the oldest brother, felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. His vision blurred, and a feeling of nausea took hold. He looked up at his wife, Sarah, who had already begun to show signs of discomfort. Her face had gone pale, and she was clutching her stomach. At first, they chalked it up to overeating, but the strange sensations quickly worsened. The room, once filled with cheerful chatter, grew eerily silent. The ticking of the old clock on the wall seemed louder, more oppressive. Mary, their youngest daughter, suddenly let out a sharp gasp. "Mom, I feel sick," she whispered, her voice trembling. And then, before anyone could react, the room seemed to spin, and everything went dark. When the Andersons woke up, they were still seated around the dinner table, the remnants of their meal untouched. It was as if no time had passed at all. But something was different. The house felt colder, the air thicker. The clock on the wall was stuck at exactly 3:37, though it had been ticking just fine earlier. "What happened?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky, looking around at the confused faces of her family. John tried to shake off the strange feeling gnawing at him, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. Suddenly, a sharp, inexplicable terror gripped each of them. The room seemed to close in, as if the walls were pressing against them, suffocating them with an unseen force. "Do you guys hear that?" whispered Mary, her eyes wide with fear. The others listened, but all they could hear was the deafening silence, broken only by their own frantic breathing. Then, John noticed something chilling. The turkey, or what was left of it, was still there on the table, its golden skin now dark and decaying. "Something's wrong," John muttered, trying to rise from his chair, but his legs felt like lead. He looked at his family, and they all had the same look in their eyes, the same fear, the same confusion. They all felt it, though none could explain what it was. It was as if time itself had stopped and was now rewinding, trapping them in some nightmare they couldn't escape. But as the fear spread, so did the dread that something far worse was about to unfold. The next moment, everything returned to normal. The house was warm again, the clock ticking away as usual, and the meal, though half-eaten, seemed perfectly fine. The family looked around, stunned, not knowing whether they had imagined the terror they'd just felt. But when they glanced at each other, they noticed the same uneasy looks, the same haunted expressions. It was as if they had just lived through a nightmare and were now trapped in a loop, though none of them spoke it aloud. "I need some air," Sarah said suddenly, standing up and heading toward the door. John, followed by the rest, rushed after her. But as soon as they stepped outside, they were hit by a wave of nausea. The world spun again. They found themselves back in the dining room, as if no time had passed. They were still at the table, still eating the same meal. "What's happening? Why are we here again?" Mary asked, her voice cracking with panic. John's mind raced. "This isn't real," he muttered, looking around, his breath quickening. We're stuck. We're stuck in this moment." His words sent a chill through the family. No one spoke, but the truth hung heavily in the air. The turkey, they realized, was cursed. And they had eaten it. The curse, whatever it was, had bound them to this horrifying cycle. A cycle that repeated over and over, with no way out. As the loop began to repeat again, the family tried everything they could think of to break free. They screamed, begged, and tried to leave the house. But each time, they ended up back in the same place. No matter how much time passed, it all started again, sitting at the table, the turkey, the strange sickness creeping into their bodies. And with every loop, the feeling of dread grew stronger. John became desperate, his mind unraveling as he tried to piece together what was happening. "We're not dying, not yet," he whispered. "But we're living the last moments before we die, over and over again." Sarah shook her head, unable to process the horror. The family members' faces were gaunt and tired, the fear written in their eyes, as if they had aged years within hours. They were being forced to relive the last moments of their lives, and they couldn't break free. The room, the house, and even their own bodies felt like they were part of some twisted punishment. "I don't want to eat anymore," Mary said, her voice small and trembling. "Please, can't we just stop?" But there was no answer. The turkey, now cold and decaying, sat silently in front of them, a silent witness to their torment. The family was trapped in a cycle of death and rebirth, unable to escape the curse they had unknowingly embraced. Hours, days, weeks, time lost all meaning. The family members couldn't tell how long they had been stuck in this nightmare. They had tried everything to break free, praying, pleading, even attempting to destroy the turkey. But no matter what they did, they always ended up right back at the table, the cursed meal in front of them. The nausea, the dizziness, the fear, it never stopped. "Why are we doing this?" Sarah asked one evening, her voice broken. "Why are we still here, still eating?" Her words were hollow, a reflection of the endless loop that had consumed them. John didn't have an answer. There was nothing to say. The family had become hollow too, their bodies mere shells, trapped in a fate they couldn't escape. And with each new loop, something worse began to happen. Their minds started to fracture, their memories blending together, making it harder to distinguish the present from the past. The dread that had once been a quiet whisper was now a deafening scream in their ears. But there was no escape, no way to break the curse. The house, once a place of comfort, had become a prison. And no one would ever leave. As the loops continued, the family's desperation grew. They stopped speaking to each other, each person trapped in their own personal hell. The moments before death became clearer, more vivid. They could see the turkey, feel the sickness creeping into their bodies, and they knew what would happen next. The fear was unbearable, but they had no choice but to endure it. Then, one night, as the loop began again, something changed. The turkey, this cursed, decaying bird, seemed to move on its own, as if it had a life of its own. A low growl echoed through the house, and the family stared in horror as the bird's eyes seemed to glow red, a malevolent energy radiating from it. The curse had taken on a new form. It was no longer just a simple repetition, it was alive, feeding off their fear, their suffering. The house began to tremble, the walls cracking as if the very foundations of reality were breaking apart. The family, now pale and broken, looked at each other with terror in their eyes. They knew the end was coming, and there would be no escape. No one would survive this time. The curse had them, body and soul, and there was no way out. In the final loop, the Anderson family found themselves back at the table, though they barely resembled the people they once were. Their faces were hollow, their eyes sunken with the weight of endless suffering. The air was thick with the smell of decay, The turkey, now a grotesque, pulsating mass, sat before them, waiting for them to eat once again. But no one moved. They had nothing left. A voice, deep and ancient, echoed through the house. "This is your fate," it whispered, a cold and malevolent tone. "You will never leave. You will never escape." And with those words, the house seemed to collapse in on itself, the walls closing in, the family's screams swallowed by the darkness. There was no more time. No more chances. The curse had claimed them all. The Anderson family, trapped forever in their last moments, would never know peace. Their Thanksgiving feast was their end, and nothing could save them from the endless cycle of death they had unknowingly brought upon themselves.
Story 2.
It was supposed to be a peaceful Thanksgiving dinner. Just me, my wife, and our old family friend, Richard, who had mysteriously disappeared a few years back. We had invited him to celebrate with us on our secluded farm. The house, a century-old farmhouse with its creaking floors and antique furniture, felt warm and inviting as we set the table with a feast of turkey, mashed potatoes, and all the traditional fixings. Everything was perfect, or at least, it seemed that way. When Richard arrived, I immediately felt something was off. He was thinner than I remembered, his face gaunt, and his eyes, different. They were too wide, too intense. But it was his mannerisms that made me uneasy. He didn't greet us with the usual warmth, no jokes or laughter, just a stiff handshake and a quiet nod. I glanced at my wife, who seemed equally confused by the way he was acting. She shrugged it off, but the feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. As we sat down to eat, the room grew silent. The usual chatter we had when Richard visited was absent. His movements were strange, almost mechanical. He would stare at his plate for a long time before eating, his eyes never meeting ours. Every time I spoke to him, I noticed his response was just a little too delayed, like he was carefully choosing his words. The air felt heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The first strange incident happened when Richard reached for the salt. He didn't just sprinkle it on his food, like any normal person would. Instead, he held the salt shaker in his hand, staring at it, almost mesmerized. Then, with a sudden, jerky motion, he poured the entire contents onto his plate. "A little extra flavor," he muttered, but there was no smile. No warmth. Just an eerie coldness in his voice. My wife and I exchanged uneasy glances, but we didn't know how to address it. He was our guest, after all. Things only got worse as the night went on. At one point, Richard dropped his fork, but when he bent down to pick it up, his movement was too quick, unnaturally quick, like an animal snapping to attention. His eyes darted toward the window, and for a brief moment, he looked terrified, his pupils wide with fear. It didn't make sense. There was nothing outside. Nothing but the darkness of the farmland, miles from the nearest neighbor. By the time dessert was served, Richard's behavior had completely changed. He wasn't just strange, he was unsettling. He stared at the pumpkin pie for far too long, his hand hovering over it as if unsure whether to touch it. When he finally took a bite, his face twisted into an expression of disgust. "It's not right," he said softly, almost to himself. "It doesn't taste like it should." I tried to laugh it off, but my heart raced. My wife didn't even look at me, she just kept her head down, focusing on her plate. As the evening wore on, Richard's behavior became more erratic. He stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and started pacing around the room. "It's here," he muttered under his breath. "It's here." I didn't know what he was talking about, but the way he said it sent chills down my spine. His words didn't make sense. He wasn't talking to us anymore. It was as if he was talking to someone, or something, else. I tried to approach him, but he backed away from me quickly, his eyes wide with panic. "Don't come closer," he hissed, his voice low and guttural. "You don't know what it is." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Something was wrong. This wasn't Richard. It couldn't be. The man I had known for years would never act like this. He would never be afraid of me. In a desperate attempt to snap him out of whatever trance he was in, I called out his name, Richard. But when he turned around, I could see it clearly now. His eyes were empty, hollow, as if someone or something had stolen his soul. The room went cold, and for the first time that night, I was truly afraid. "What have you done to him?" I whispered, but before I could react, Richard, or whatever was wearing his skin, smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was a grin full of malice, something that didn't belong. The fear that had been creeping up on me suddenly exploded. I looked at my wife, who was now visibly trembling, her face pale with horror. She grabbed my arm, her grip tight and shaking. "We need to leave. Now." I didn't argue. We had to get away from him. From it. I don't know what I thought it was, but it was clear that the man who had been our friend was no longer in that body. We ran toward the door, but Richard was suddenly in our way, blocking the exit with terrifying speed. "You can't leave," he said in a voice that wasn't his, a voice too deep, too dark. "You're mine now. You can't escape." His words sent a wave of panic through me. I grabbed my wife's hand and tried to push past him, but the air felt thick, like something was holding us back. The room started to spin, and the walls seemed to close in. Just as I thought we were trapped, I heard something outside. A faint sound, distant but growing louder. It sounded like chanting, like whispers in the wind. Richard's eyes flickered toward the window, his face going pale. "No," he whispered, backing away from us. "It's here." In a flash, he bolted out the door, disappearing into the dark, leaving us standing there, confused and terrified. We couldn't stay there any longer. The house felt suffocating, as if it was alive and watching us. We locked the doors and windows, trying to make sense of everything that had happened, but the more we thought about it, the more it didn't add up. Richard had disappeared for years, and when he finally returned, it wasn't him at all. It was something else that had taken his place. I couldn't stop thinking about his strange behavior, the way he seemed so disconnected from reality, like he was in a trance. And then there was the look in his eyes. That hollow, soulless gaze. It wasn't just the look of a man who had been gone too long. It was the look of someone, or something, that wasn't human anymore. We tried calling the police, but no one would answer. The farm was so far out, and the storm that had begun to rage outside made it impossible to leave. We were trapped. And then, as the wind howled and the storm picked up, we heard something outside again, scratching at the door. It wasn't a human sound. It was something far worse. The storm outside was deafening. The windows rattled as the wind picked up, and the whole house seemed to groan under the pressure. But the real terror came when the scratching at the door stopped. Everything went eerily silent, and I knew, deep down, that something was lurking just outside, waiting for the right moment. I wanted to leave, but there was nowhere to go. The isolation of the farm was both a blessing and a curse. Suddenly, the door to the kitchen creaked open. I looked over at my wife, whose face was drenched in sweat, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" she whispered, but I couldn't answer. I was frozen in place, staring at the figure standing in the doorway. It was Richard, or rather, the thing that had once been Richard. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were completely black now, devoid of any humanity. "We can't escape," the thing that had once been Richard said, its voice a low rasp. "You're already part of this." As it stepped closer, its body seemed to distort, like it was struggling to hold its shape. I reached for the phone, my hands shaking, but the screen was blank. No signal. I looked back up, and the thing was gone. But the silence that followed was worse than anything I had ever heard. The next morning, we found ourselves in the same place, as if the night had never happened. The door to the kitchen was closed, and everything seemed calm again. But I knew better. We weren't safe. We could feel the presence of something watching us, waiting for the next move. It had taken Richard, or had it? What if Richard was never coming back? What if we were next? We tried to leave, but the moment we stepped outside, everything froze. The world outside was different, darker. The trees were twisted, the fields empty. And in the distance, I saw it, Richard's figure, standing motionless, staring at us with those empty, black eyes. It smiled, and I knew then, this wasn't a friend. It never had been. We were trapped in a nightmare, and there was no way out. The last thing I remember before the darkness took over was my wife's scream as the thing that was once Richard lunged at us. And then, nothing. Just the endless silence. We had become part of the farm now. Part of whatever cursed this place. Forever.
Story 3.
It started as a perfect Thanksgiving evening. The air outside was cold, but inside our little house, we were all gathered around the table, laughing and sharing stories. The smell of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie filled the room, and everything felt right. There was my wife, Sarah, my 2 kids, Emily and Jack, and my brother, Tom, who had driven up from the city. We hadn't been together like this in a while, and it felt like the holiday magic was truly in the air. Then, the snow began to fall. At first, it was nothing unusual. Just a few flakes drifting gently down from the sky. But as we sat down for dessert, something odd happened. The snow didn't seem to be falling around the house, it was only landing on our yard. The ground around the house began to turn white, as if a curtain of snow was drawn around us. I stood up to look outside, and the rest of the land, nothing. Just the blackness of the woods, untouched by the snow. "Must be a freak storm," Tom said, shrugging. "We're lucky it's not reaching the road." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The snow wasn't natural. It didn't belong here, not like this. It was as if it was trying to trap us, to keep us in. As the snow piled up, the temperature inside the house began to drop. We huddled closer together, trying to ignore the chill creeping through the walls. But the sound was what made me uneasy. It started as a faint scraping sound outside, like something dragging itself across the snow. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or something caught in the storm. But the sound grew louder, sharper, as if whatever was out there was getting closer. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, thinking I could see what was going on. But when I opened the door, the air outside felt wrong, thick, like the snow was suffocating the very breath from my lungs. I flashed the beam of the light across the yard, and that's when I saw it. The snow, it was moving. Not falling, but shifting, like it had a life of its own. The area around the house was thick with it, and in the darkness, I thought I saw something large, moving just beyond the reach of the light. "Get back inside, now!" I shouted, but it was too late. My brother Tom had already stepped out, and when he turned around to look at me, his face went pale. He froze, staring at something behind me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Or so I thought. That's when we heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the darkness just beyond the snow. The sound sent a chill down my spine, and before I could react, I felt something cold brush past me, as if something unseen had just passed within inches of my body. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I couldn't explain it. The growl wasn't like anything I'd ever heard. It was an animal, not exactly. It was more like something hungry. Something waiting. We all sat in silence, trying to ignore the feeling of eyes watching us from outside. The snow kept falling, but now it wasn't just falling, it was creeping closer, inch by inch, as if it were trying to crawl into the house itself. And then it happened. Emily screamed from the kitchen. We ran to her, only to find the room completely dark. The lights had flickered off, and as I rushed to turn them back on, I saw something in the window, a shape, a shadow. It was too big to be a person, too fast. It vanished before I could even get a clear look, but the terror in my daughter's eyes told me enough. Whatever it wasn't human. The fear spread like wildfire through the house. We barricaded the windows and locked every door, but nothing felt safe. The snow continued to fall, now covering the house completely, leaving us isolated in a cocoon of light. The growl from outside grew louder, more persistent. It was circling the house, always just out of sight, always just beyond the reach of the light. That's when I heard it, the scratching at the door. Not from the outside, but from the inside, like something was trying to get in. My heart raced, and I grabbed a kitchen knife. "Stay away from the door," I whispered to my family, but my voice barely sounded above the storm's roar. Whatever was out there, whatever had made that noise, wasn't just outside. It had found its way into the house. Suddenly, the front door flew open with a violent crash. I tried to reach for it, but it slammed back against the wall, and standing there in the threshold, covered in snow, was Tom. He was panting, his eyes wild, his clothes torn. It's in here," he gasped, but before he could say anything more, the door slammed shut again, and he collapsed onto the floor. I rushed to him, but when I tried to help him up, I noticed the blood. His leg, it was torn open, as if something had ripped into it. We couldn't stay in the house any longer. Tom was in pain, and the house felt like it was closing in on us. But the storm outside, the snow was everywhere, and there was nowhere to run. It was like the world had been covered in a blanket of cold and death. I tried to help Tom up, but his leg was useless. There was no way we could carry him. I turned to Sarah, but her face was white with terror. She knew it, too. The thing in the snow had already found its way inside. Suddenly, I heard the growl again, closer this time, like it was right outside the walls. The snow wasn't just on the ground anymore, it was creeping up the walls of the house, slowly, silently. Whatever this thing was, it was feeding off the darkness, and the snow was its weapon. The longer it fell, the more it claimed. "We have to leave," I whispered, but as I moved toward the door, I froze. Tom had been lying still, but now, he wasn't moving at all. His eyes were wide, staring at something. Something in the corner of the room. I followed his gaze, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The shape from the darkness, the shadow we'd seen earlier, was there, hovering, just outside the light. And it was coming closer. Panic took over. I tried to reach for Tom, but he was already gone, pulled into the darkness. His scream echoed through the house, but it was quickly muffled, as if something had swallowed him whole. My wife and kids were crying, but there was no time to grieve. We had to move, had to find a way out before we were next. The house seemed to be closing in on us, the walls too tight, the air too cold. The snow was everywhere now, crawling over every inch of the house, smothering us in its icy grip. I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned, there was no one there. Just the oppressive silence of the storm, the endless growl from the outside, and the heavy crunch of snow beneath something unseen. We moved as quickly as we could, but with every step, it felt like the house was shrinking around us. And then, the last blow. My son Jack, my little boy, was gone. I didn't even see it happen. One moment, he was holding my hand, and the next, he was swallowed by the snow. I screamed his name, but the snow had already taken him. It had taken everything. By the time I realized it was too late, the house was buried under a thick layer of snow, the ground and sky blending into one endless white void. My wife and I were the last ones left, and the cold had seeped so deep into our bones that we could hardly move. The growl was deafening now, all around us, and in the distance, I saw it again, the shadow, the thing that had been hunting us all night. We didn't stand a chance. As we stood there, trying to make one last attempt to escape, the snow closed in around us. I turned to Sarah, my heart breaking. "I love you," I whispered, but she didn't hear me. Her eyes were frozen, her body limp, and then, just like that, she was gone. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the shadow, looming over everything, waiting for the snow to consume me entirely.
Story 4.
It was a crisp Thanksgiving morning, and the house was full of warmth and laughter. My family and I had gathered in our old farmhouse, nestled on the outskirts of town. We were preparing for the holiday feast when something caught my eye, an old, worn table sitting in the corner of the dining room. It was covered in dust, as if it hadn't been touched in years, but there was something about it that intrigued me. My father, who had lived in this house for as long as I could remember, told me it was an ancient relic. Rumor had it, it once belonged to the first settlers of this area. They say it was passed down through generations, each one carrying its own dark history. We didn't think much of it at first, but as we set the table for our Thanksgiving dinner, I noticed that everyone seemed to gravitate towards it. The chairs were perfectly arranged, like the table was inviting us to sit. I didn't question it. After all, it was a holiday, and we were all just happy to be together. We took our seats, my mother at the head of the table, my father beside her, and the rest of us spread around. As soon as we sat down, the room fell oddly silent. The warmth from the kitchen, the smell of turkey, the sound of laughter, all of it faded away as if something had just shifted in the air. And then it started. A strange noise came from the hallway, a dragging sound, like something heavy was being moved across the floor. We all looked at each other, puzzled, but none of us got up to investigate. Instead, we stayed seated, frozen in place, waiting for it to pass. But the noise didn't stop. It grew louder, closer. My sister, who was sitting across from me, glanced over at me with wide eyes, and I could see she was starting to feel uncomfortable too. We couldn't figure out what was happening, but something in the room felt wrong, like we were no longer alone. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and I felt an icy chill brush against my skin. It wasn't just the cold air creeping in from the cracks in the windows, it was something deeper, something unsettling. My mother, trying to calm us, laughed nervously. "It's just the old wiring. Nothing to worry about." But I could tell she didn't believe it herself. That's when the first thing happened. One of the chairs moved. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but just enough that the legs scraped the floor. We all stared at it in silence, unsure of how to react. I wanted to laugh it off, but I couldn't ignore the fear creeping up my spine. My father stood up to check the hallway, but as he walked toward the door, a glass from the kitchen counter suddenly tipped over, shattering on the floor. We all turned to look at it, but no one had moved to knock it over. "What the hell?" my brother muttered, his voice trembling. As he said it, the door to the kitchen creaked open on its own, swinging back and forth, like someone had just passed through. We all froze. There was no one there. The room felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in on us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. When my father returned from the hallway, he seemed different, distant, almost like he had seen something that shook him. He didn't say a word, just sat back down, his eyes darting around the room. That's when the next thing happened. A faint whisper, barely audible, seemed to come from nowhere. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it repeated, a voice speaking words I couldn't make out. My mother looked at me, her face pale, and whispered, "Do you hear that?" But no one spoke up. The tension in the room was unbearable. I wanted to leave. I really did. But something kept me at that table, as if the room itself was holding me in place. My eyes kept darting to the old table we were sitting at, and I could swear it looked different, darker somehow, as though it had a life of its own. The edges of the table seemed to have grown sharper, and the wood, once smooth, now seemed to have strange markings on it, symbols, or perhaps scars. It was impossible to tell, but there was something undeniably wrong about it. Just as I was about to get up, I heard a loud crash from upstairs. We all jumped, and my father quickly stood up, his face pale as a ghost. "I'll go check it out," he said, but before he could move, my mother's voice cut through the tension. "Don't go upstairs. We're not alone here. I feel it." Her voice trembled, and the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. None of us spoke. We just sat there, caught in the gravity of the moment, staring at each other, feeling as though the house itself had become a prison. That's when we saw it. In the reflection of the old, dusty mirror hanging on the wall, there was a shadow moving across the room. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, but then it grew larger, darker, moving against the grain of the room. We all saw it. My brother stood up and yelled, "What the hell is that?" The shadow seemed to stretch across the mirror, growing impossibly large, its edges fraying like smoke. It wasn't a person. It was something else, something far worse. We couldn't move. The house seemed to be closing in on us, the walls stretching outward, the shadows growing deeper. My father grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door, but before we could leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The light in the room flickered violently, and the whispering grew louder, more frantic. I couldn't understand the words, but I felt them, like they were trying to invade my mind. The air grew thick with an overwhelming sense of dread, and then I saw it. On the wall behind the table, a carving began to appear, as though it were being etched into the wood by an invisible hand. It was the first settler's symbol, a warning, according to the old stories my father had told me. But it wasn't just a symbol, it was a curse. The table had claimed its next victims, us. The moment we sat down at it, we had sealed our fate. I realized with a sinking heart that this had happened before, every year, on Thanksgiving. The table was hungry for souls, and each year, it consumed more. We were part of a dark, repeating history that no one had ever escaped. I turned to my family, my heart pounding in my chest. "We need to get out of here, now," I whispered, my voice barely a breath. But it was too late. The shadows had already started to move, swirling around us, pulling us back toward the table. No one could escape. The room was no longer a place we could leave, It was a trap, set in motion by the very table we had chosen to sit at. The room seemed to twist as the shadows closed in, swallowing the light and the warmth. The table now seemed alive, its surface rippling like water, drawing us in with a force I couldn't explain. My family was paralyzed with fear, their eyes wide with terror, and I could see that the shadows had begun to pull at their limbs, dragging them back toward the table. I reached out to grab my father, but my hands passed through him as if he were made of smoke. I turned to my mother, but she was already gone, her body twisted and pulled into the table, vanishing without a trace. I was next. The darkness enveloped me, and I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the shadows. The table loomed before me, its cursed surface gleaming in the faint light. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the symbol on the wall, glowing like fire, marking the end of our family story. Thanksgiving had become a ritual of death, and we were now part of it, another chapter in the table's dark history, destined to repeat every year. When I woke up, I was back at the table. The room was still and silent, as if nothing had ever happened. The table, now polished and pristine, gleamed under the dim light. I couldn't understand it at first, but then I looked around. The house was empty. My family, gone. The house felt cold and abandoned, the air thick with the same suffocating presence I had felt earlier. The history had repeated itself. I tried to stand up, but my body felt heavy, like it didn't belong to me. My legs wouldn't move. The shadows were still there, lurking at the edges of my vision, watching me. It was like I was trapped in a never-ending loop, reliving the same horror over and over again. Every Thanksgiving, I would be here, seated at this cursed table, waiting for the inevitable. And then, I realized the truth. The table didn't just claim those who sat at it, it made them part of its curse, forever bound to the darkness that surrounded it. I was never going to leave. I was never going to escape. The table had already claimed me, and it was going to claim others, year after year. The dark history would always repeat. Years passed. The house, the table, the memories, they were all part of the same nightmare. Every Thanksgiving, I waited. I sat at the table, waiting for the new victims to come, just like my family had once done. I could hear their voices in my head, the whispers of the ones who had come before me, the ones who had been taken by the table. They were trapped here, just like me, forever caught in the cycle of the curse. No one ever came to check on the house. No one ever came to look for us. We were lost to time, to the curse of the table. Every year, we became part of the dark story, a story that no one could escape. And so, we waited until the next Thanksgiving, when new victims would come, and the table would claim them too. The cycle would never end. The curse would never break. And as I sat there, waiting for the next set of unsuspecting souls to walk through the door, I knew one thing for certain: Thanksgiving would never be the same again.
Story 5.
It was the kind of Thanksgiving that was perfect in every way. The smell of turkey, mashed potatoes, and pumpkin pie filled the air, and my family sat around the dinner table, laughing and sharing stories. After the meal, my father suggested we take a walk through the forest behind our house. It was a tradition that had been passed down for generations, just a short stroll to give thanks for the harvest. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. We grabbed our coats and headed out. As we walked deeper into the woods, something felt off. At first, I couldn't place it. The forest was peaceful, the leaves crunching beneath our feet, but there was an eerie stillness to it. My younger brother, who was usually full of energy, kept glancing around nervously, but no one paid much attention. We were too busy enjoying the walk and the beautiful, quiet evening. That's when I first noticed it. The sun hadn't set fully yet, but the sky seemed darker, almost as if the trees themselves were blocking out the light. We kept walking, but with each step, the woods began to feel thicker, like we were pushing through something heavier. The air grew colder, and the world around us felt like it was shrinking. "It's just the forest," my dad said, trying to reassure us. But the unease continued to grow. We came to a small clearing where we had always stopped to rest, but today it didn't feel familiar. The ground was wet, the trees taller than I remembered. It was as if the forest had changed while we weren't looking. We tried to shake off the strange feeling and sat down to rest. The air had a strange heaviness to it, like something was watching us. My sister mentioned how she thought she saw something moving between the trees, but when we all turned to look, there was nothing there. We laughed it off, though the tension was starting to creep into our voices. My father pulled out his watch, but when he checked the time, his expression changed. It wasn't that the time was wrong, it was just stuck. It wasn't moving. "That's odd," he muttered. "It was just working fine earlier." That's when I realized something. The sounds of the forest had stopped. The rustling of the leaves, the chirping of birds, the wind, everything had gone dead silent. It was as though the world itself had stopped breathing. I felt a chill run down my spine, but before I could say anything, the silence was broken by a sound. Faint at first, it was almost like a whisper, but then it grew louder, more distinct. My father stood up quickly, his face pale, his hand gripping the watch like it was the only thing tethering him to reality. "We need to go back," he said, his voice sharp with panic. We turned to head back, but the forest now seemed different. The path we had walked down was gone. Instead, the trees twisted in unnatural ways, their branches stretching like fingers. And that's when I saw it. In the distance, there was a figure. Tall, black, and featureless, standing perfectly still. It wasn't a person, but something more, something that didn't belong. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned to my family, but they didn't seem to notice. They just kept walking, as though they couldn't see what I was seeing. I tried to call out to them, but my voice wouldn't come. It was like the air had thickened around me, pressing in from all sides. My feet moved of their own accord, following my family, even though my mind screamed for me to stop. As we walked further into the woods, the trees grew even darker, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. My father was now ahead of us, moving faster, as if he were in a hurry, but he wasn't responding to us anymore. His face was blank, his eyes glazed over. I called his name, but he didn't answer. It was as though he couldn't hear me, like I wasn't even there. We reached another clearing, but it wasn't like the ones we had visited before. The sky above us was pitch black, and there were no stars, just an endless, empty void. My sister grabbed my arm, her fingers cold and trembling. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't know how to answer her. My mind was racing, but every thought felt disconnected, like I couldn't hold on to anything for too long. And then, I heard it again, the whispering. This time, it was louder, coming from all around us, filling the space between the trees. The whispering seemed to have a rhythm to it, like a chant. It was indecipherable, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. The trees began to move, slowly at first, but then faster, their branches swaying like they were alive. The figure from before was closer now, standing at the edge of the clearing. I could see it more clearly, its face was hollow, an endless darkness where its features should have been. It was watching us. And with each step we took, The ground beneath our feet felt more unstable, as if the earth itself was shifting under us. I grabbed my father's arm, shaking him. "We need to go, now." But when I looked into his eyes, I realized he wasn't there anymore. He was gone. His body was still standing, but he was empty, his soul lost to whatever had taken hold of him. I turned to my family, but they, too, were different. Their eyes were empty, their faces frozen in blank expressions. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was like the world had muted itself, trapping us in this strange, endless moment. We kept walking, though I didn't know why. Something pushed us forward, like an invisible force, and every step took us deeper into the darkness. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, until it was deafening. And then, it happened. The sky above us tore open, and for a brief moment, I saw a glimpse of something vast and otherworldly. It was like looking into an abyss, and I felt myself being pulled toward it. The trees around us began to bend and twist, reaching toward the rift in the sky. I turned to my family, but they were already moving toward it. Their bodies weren't their own anymore, they were puppets, controlled by whatever force had taken hold of the forest. "No!" I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the air. I tried to run, to break free, but the ground beneath me turned to mud, and I stumbled. As I fell to my knees, I looked up to see the figure standing over me. Its empty, black eyes were staring down, and I realized, with a sudden clarity, what it was. It was time itself, frozen, endless, a loop that would never break. The figure reached down and touched my forehead, and the world around me shattered. The trees, the sky, the whispering, all of it dissolved into nothingness. I found myself back at the dinner table, the one we had just left before the walk. My family was there, sitting as if nothing had happened. The food was still on the table, the turkey still warm. The light from the window was soft, the sun setting as it had before. But something was wrong. The air felt thick again, and the whispering returned, faint but persistent. I stood up, my legs unsteady, my heart pounding in my chest. "What's going on?" I whispered to myself. But no one responded. My family didn't seem to notice me anymore. They just sat there, frozen in place, locked in this moment like they were part of a memory. I reached out to touch my father, but my hand passed through him like he was a shadow. Panic began to rise in my chest, and I backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But it was. The room around me began to fade, and I felt myself being pulled backward, back into the woods. The trees were waiting for me, their twisted branches reaching for me as I was dragged through the forest, helpless. I tried to fight, but it was no use. The forest had claimed me, just like it had claimed my family. There was no escape. And then, just before I lost consciousness, I heard it, the whispering. Louder now, more insistent, repeating the same words over and over again, "Thanksgiving will never end." When I woke up again, I was standing in the same clearing, surrounded by the same twisted trees. The sky was still pitch black, the air cold and heavy. My family was gone. I was alone in the forest, but I could feel them, feel their presence. Their souls were trapped here, just like mine, caught in this eternal cycle. The forest had claimed us all, and now, we were part of its dark ritual. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was locked in this place, forced to relive the same Thanksgiving over and over again, without end. The whispering was all around me, growing louder with each passing second. It was the forest, the figure, time itself, all working together to trap us here. I could see them now, The others who had been taken, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. They were part of it too. They were waiting for the next family to come, to join the endless cycle. But as I looked around, I realized something. The next family was already here. They were walking into the forest, just like we had, unaware of the fate that awaited them. They were smiling, laughing, thinking this was just another peaceful Thanksgiving walk. But I knew the truth. The forest was waiting for them. And soon, they would be part of this never-ending nightmare. The whispering grew louder as the family approached. I wanted to warn them, to scream, but it was too late. The figure was already there, waiting for them. It was time. Time to claim them, just like it had claimed us. And as they stepped into the clearing, the forest closed around them, trapping them in its eternal grasp. I stood there, watching them, knowing that I could never escape. The cycle would continue, and Thanksgiving would go on forever, repeating, over and over, with no end in sight. The forest had taken us all, and now it was taking them. And so, we would remain, forever trapped in this nightmare of our own making. Forever lost in the darkness, forever caught in the endless loop of Thanksgiving.
Story 6.
It was the perfect Thanksgiving evening. The Smith family had just moved into their new house a few weeks prior, and they were excited to celebrate the holiday in their fresh, spacious home. The aroma of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie filled the air as they gathered around the table. Laughter echoed through the rooms, everyone talking about what they were thankful for. After the meal, they decided to relax in front of the fireplace, enjoying the warmth and comfort of their new surroundings. Everything felt right. But that's when it started. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere below them. At first, they thought it was the house settling, an old creak here and there. But then, a soft shuffling noise followed, like footsteps dragging across the floor. Mr. Smith, a practical man, shrugged it off. "It's probably just the old pipes or maybe a rat in the basement," he said, trying to ease his wife's growing unease. But it wasn't just a random noise. It kept happening, growing louder and more distinct with each passing hour. By midnight, the sounds were unmistakable. There were footsteps, heavy ones, pacing in the basement. At times, it sounded like something was dragging along the floor. Then, it was a low murmur, muttering or whispering, impossible to make out but unnerving nonetheless. The family exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether they should investigate. But as the hours passed, the sounds grew more persistent, relentless. It wasn't just one noise anymore, it was an odd combination of steps, scraping, and what sounded like a voice, or something trying to speak. The house, once so inviting, now felt foreign and unsettling. Mr. Smith decided it was time to check it out. "We need to see what's down there," he said, his voice tense. The basement door was always a little stiff, but it creaked open with an ominous groan as he turned the handle. The moment the door opened, a cold rush of air hit them, and the smell of mildew and something metallic filled their noses. The stairs leading down to the basement were steep and narrow, and as they descended, the air seemed to grow thicker with every step. The further they went, the louder the sounds became. At the bottom of the stairs, they froze. The whispering had stopped, replaced with something much worse. The sound of footsteps, identical to their own, echoed in the narrow space. It was like someone was following them, step by step, but when they turned around, the basement was empty. The sounds matched their every movement, as if they were trapped in a loop, but there was no one there. Mr. Smith called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" But the only response was the faint thudding of feet on the concrete. And then, a voice. A low murmur, almost like a chant. It was impossible to understand, but it felt wrong. Terrified, the family rushed up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind them. The house had gone eerily quiet again, but the unsettling feeling lingered. Maybe it was just the pipes after all, Mrs. Smith said, trying to reassure herself and the kids. But the doubt in her voice made it clear she wasn't convinced. They tried to return to their Thanksgiving celebration, but no one felt safe. The house, their beautiful new home, now felt suffocating, as if something was waiting in the shadows, watching them. And the noise had not stopped, it was still there, faintly echoing from below, waiting for the next move. The next few hours passed uneasily. Every so often, someone would hear the sound again, the same dragging footsteps, the low murmur. It was as if the noises had a pattern, growing louder and more pronounced, until they couldn't ignore it anymore. By 2 a.m., everyone was on edge. The house felt colder, and the whispers seemed to be getting closer, almost like they were right behind them. Mrs. Smith suggested they call someone, maybe a neighbor or even a professional, but her husband insisted on checking again. "There's got to be a logical explanation," he said, though even he was beginning to sound uncertain. This time, when they opened the basement door, the air felt heavier. The footsteps were there again, louder this time, as if someone was pacing the floor directly beneath them. The family gathered at the top of the stairs, watching in horror as the sound of their own movements seemed to echo back at them. But this time, it was different. They realized the footsteps weren't just mimicking them, they were following them, each step a distorted version of their own. "It's like they're copying us," Mr. Smith whispered, his voice tight with fear. "But how? What the hell is going on?" The murmuring was louder now, a low, guttural chant. Mrs. Smith shivered, pulling her children closer to her. "We need to get out of here," she said, but Mr. Smith stood frozen at the top of the stairs. His eyes were wide, staring into the darkness below. He heard something else now, something new. A voice, deep and familiar, but not his own. "It's us," the voice said, in a tone that wasn't his. "We are you." It wasn't a whisper anymore, it was clear and unmistakable. The moment those words were spoken, Mr. Smith slammed the basement door shut with a force that rattled the house. His breath came in short gasps as he backed away from the door, his mind racing. "What the hell did we just hear?" he muttered under his breath, but no one answered. They all felt it, something was wrong, something was in the house with them, something that wasn't supposed to be. The atmosphere in the room felt charged, like a storm was brewing. The air was thick with tension, and the silence that followed felt unbearable. They tried to ignore the noises, to pretend everything was fine, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The house had never felt so foreign, so sinister. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, every rustling of leaves outside, the noises from the basement were everywhere. And with each passing hour, they grew louder. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, waiting. But what for? By 4 a.m., they could hear footsteps on every floor, in every room. It wasn't just the basement anymore. The sounds were everywhere, creeping through the walls and floors, surrounding them. "We need to leave," Mrs. Smith said, her voice trembling. "Now." But when they tried to make their way to the door, they found themselves stuck, as if the house had closed in around them. The door wouldn't open. They were trapped. Panic set in. The family moved from room to room, trying every door and window, but nothing opened. They were sealed in, confined to the very house that had once seemed like a dream. The footsteps followed them, always one step behind. No matter where they went, the sounds were there, just out of sight. It was impossible to escape. They could hear the murmurings growing louder, too. The voice that had spoken before wasn't just repeating what they did anymore. It was speaking to them now, directing them. "Come back to the basement," it said, in a voice that wasn't quite human, but also familiar. The house began to feel like a maze. Every room looked the same, and no matter how many times they turned a corner or opened a door, they always found themselves back at the center of it all, at the basement door. It was as if they were walking in circles, reliving the same moments over and over again. And with each new round, the footsteps grew louder. The voice grew clearer. "Come back," it said again, a whisper now, but with a sickening edge. "We are waiting for you." Desperation took over. The family couldn't take it anymore. Mr. Smith, despite every instinct telling him to run, made a decision. He grabbed the doorknob, determined to face whatever lay behind it. When he turned it, the door creaked open. But what they saw was far worse than anything they could have imagined. The basement was no longer empty. The dark void that had once been the basement had transformed into something else entirely. Shadows writhed along the walls, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The footsteps they had been hearing were coming from the far corner, where the shadows seemed to move on their own, swirling in a way that didn't make sense. And there, in the center of the room, stood them. It was impossible to tell who or what they were, but they were copies of the family, standing perfectly still, their eyes vacant and glassy. They looked like them, moved like them, but there was something wrong. Something twisted. "We are you," the voice echoed one last time, now coming from these dark figures. The family couldn't move. They couldn't speak. The air was suffocating, heavy with the realization that whatever had been mimicking them was now alive, standing in front of them. Without warning, the figures began to move toward them. Slowly at first, but then faster, quicker. And before Mr. Smith could react, they were upon him, the figures reaching out with cold, clammy hands, their mouths gaping open. The last thing he saw was his own face, twisted in an unnatural grin, before everything went dark. The next morning, the house was quiet. The sounds were gone. The air was still. The Smith family was never seen again. The house stood there, abandoned, just like it had been before. But now, every so often, if you listen closely, you can hear it. The sound of footsteps, dragging across the floor. The murmur of a voice, faint but there. And if you're brave enough to go down into the basement, you might just see them, the Smith family, forever trapped, forever part of the house, their voices lost in the darkness. The house, once a symbol of hope and new beginnings, had become a prison. A place where time had no meaning, where the past and present collided. And the footsteps? They'll never stop. They'll keep echoing through the halls, repeating, over and over, forever. Just waiting for the next family.